I welcome everyone to an evening with Professor Jason Hill at John Marshall Law School. And I want to give a few shout outs to some special guests that are here with us tonight. We have Sandy Geringer, who's the president of the Chicago Republican Women's Network. And we have Lynn Franco, 8th Ward GOP committeeman. Linda Tabensky, the Oak Park Republican committeeman. She came here all the way from Oak Park, if you can believe that. And the selfie king of Facebook, of course, Mark Weiermueller, who everybody knows. He's doing it right now, everybody. Come on, he's doing it right now. Well done. Definitely put that on Facebook, and give a special shout out to Can TV, who came this evening to record our event. So that said, let me tell you a few words about our guest speaker, then I'll turn it over to him. Dr. Hill was educated at Purdue University, his areas of specialization being ethics, social and political philosophy, cosmopolitanism, maybe you can explain what that is, by the way, when you get up here, philosophical psychology, the philosophy of education, and race theory. He's the author of multiple books, Becoming a Cosmopolitan, What It Means to Be a Human Being in the New Millennium, Beyond Blood Identities, Post-Humanity in the 21st Century, Civil Disobedience and the Politics of Identity, When We Should Not Get Along, and his upcoming most recent book, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American People. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Jason Hill from Depaul University.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. So what I'll do is I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, who I am, and then I will read about maybe 3 or 4 pages from my forthcoming book, which will be a really good introduction into my values and what I think about this great nation of ours and my principles, and that will be a great autobiographical information. So I was born and raised in Jamaica and came to this great country in 1985 at the age of 20, which gives you some indication of my age. And wanted to be here, wanted to be in America, because I thought that this was, and still am convinced that this is the greatest country on the face of the earth. And came here to be a novelist and a poet. Didn't think I would end up being a professor of philosophy. Wanted to do a PhD in philosophy, but thought I'd somehow make my way to Hollywood and write poems and screenplays and novels. And somehow wrote the novels, wrote the screenplays, and any of them did not make their way onto the big screen, and realized that I had a vocational calling to be a philosopher as well, and did a PhD, and wrote academic books, and found myself ensconced in university, and found a liking in academic life, but also found myself strangely ensconced in a profession that was at odds with my own sensibilities as a lover of this great nation. That is, found myself among people who professed a great hatred for America. And I think we live in an era in which hatred of America has become fashionable within left-wing academic circles in this country. And so after writing 3 books in the area of cosmopolitanism, which really has to do with what it means to be a citizen of the world, what it means to be a lover of humanity, I decided to write a book on what makes the American dream possible, what makes this country great, what makes this country the greatest country on the face of the earth, what makes me a patriot. And it's being published by Simon Schuster, an imprint of Simon Schuster called Bombardier Books. It's my first big commercial book, and it's coming out in a big way. And I think that it's my pay on him to America, because America has brought me where I am. I think the American dream is not just about making it big. I think the American dream is about possibilities and about honor, grit, perseverance, faith, tenacity, and taking advantage of the multiplicity of opportunities that this great country offers people, regardless of where they come from, regardless of blood, lineage, and background. So what I'd like to do is just briefly read maybe 3 or 4 pages from the opening sections of the book, We Have Overcome, An Immigrant's Letter to the American people, with the hope that, of course, you would buy the book. And it will give you some indication of what the book is about. So the book starts off, it's a love letter, really, and it's dedicated to the American people. And it says, "My fellow Americans, we live in an era of deep resentment, envy, and hatred of our great and noble nation. It has become fashionable within certain circles in the United States of America to malign our republic as an imperialist, racist, and white supremacist country that exploits its racial minorities and keeps them outside the pantheon of the human community and the domain of the ethical. Or celebrated writers and intellectuals pen books that receive accolades by critics who claim that America is ruled by majoritarian pigs and that the American dream is a nefarious fabrication of white racists who have used it to exploit blacks. Some have claimed that the concept of the dream itself is false and that it is predicated on a specious hope that ought to be rejected by all Americans, but more specifically by black Americans. I think that we live in an age of militant, what I would call Americophobia. We live in an era when the most benevolent and moral country on earth, along with her exceptional people, with their amazing optimism, cheerfulness, and can-do forthrightness, are resented as crass, shoddy, xenophobic, and in inevitable decline. Americans as a group of people are good people, but hatred of the good for being the good, hatred for the best and noblest of virtues that reside within you, has become a fashionable emotion among certain elitist groups who resent America and her people for such virtues. They resent America for the values forged in the crucibles of an unprecedented nation state that has been a haven and a blessing for the talented, the strong, and the exceptional, but also for the poor, the benighted, the oppressed, the disenfranchised, and the dispossessed. This country could only have been such a haven because you, the American people, the most non-xenophobic and tolerant people in the world, have opened up your home to the stranger and the foreigner time and time again. You have not forced a foreigner to make a Faustian bargain with his or her native country in the name of renouncing all roots and ancestral ties. You have only demanded that he or she pledge a thin and minimal allegiance and political commitment to our great republic. You have only required that that allegiance take precedence over tribal loyalties. This is why an American in the 21st century is one essentially free of racial, ethnic, and religious clashes among all her varied peoples. These detractors of America despise the fact that America, in a fundamental sense, is like the emotion of love itself. It is a command to rise. Like the human soul, America is a moral phenomenon. These haters of America are the original incompetents and lazy non-achievers who would seek to reduce all around them to the lowest common denominator within themselves. These privileged haters of America are a range of the moment concrete-bound primitives who have never known what it is to yearn for the most American of identities. Not an ethnic or a racial one, but an aspirational one. It is an identity belonging to any man, woman, or child who longs to suffuse the world with an original assemblage of who he or she is. We, the continuously aspiring human beings, whether we are Americans or Americans in the making, hear and respond to the quintessential elegiac American voice. And it is an enticing voice, soothing and aspiring. And that American voice says, I'm an open canvas. Write and enact your script on me. Without you and your story, your narrative, the story of America is incomplete. This is America where you can suffuse the nation's vast landscape with who you are and partake in a national dialogue of becoming. By constitutional design, I think America is a place of universal belonging. It is a prototype of what a benevolent universe looks like. Because it is the first country in the world, and a fortiori, a phenomenal social experiment that explicitly rejects lineage and blood as criteria for membership and belonging. It celebrates civic nationalism in place of ethnic or cultural nationalism as a political principle that would forge a common identity among strangers and foreigners from disparate parts of the globe. You, the exceptional first people of this exceptional first nation among all nations, you, the co-creators of this most critical and reformed society on the face of the earth, have made these superlative achievements possible. The creation of your country and civilization is both a stupendous stylized work of art as well as a work in scientific precision. Its sustainability and its inexorable progress over time are unmatched and unprecedented in the history of humanity. When I personally try to tell the detractors of the American dream that it is a constitutive feature of America itself, made possible by the unbreakable spirit of the American people, they shore up a nefarious form of factionalism and appeal to an insidious cottage industry of victimology, often predicated on suffering, black suffering often, and white guilt for past transgressions that white have long atoned for as a group. The detractors keep telling me that I am complicit in a beguiling narrative that hides a form of structural oppression against certain racial groups that forever keeps them outside the ambit of the American dream and relegates them to an existential wasteland and eternal metaphysical anguish. This wasteland deliberately alienates blacks and other minorities, I'm told, from their creative agency and renders them impotent against a system stacked against them from birth. However, I adduce my own life as evidence of the utter nonsense of this narrative. I am further told that I am either a fool or a deliberate player in the white supremacist construct that is a constitutive feature of American life and identity. I resist by stating that the current progressive nature of racial politics at work in America proves that America at this time is not a white supremacist society because it does not have an official ideology of the supremacy of the white race as it might once have had, and that there are no laws explicitly preferring whites or exclusionary or punitive of non-whites simply on the grounds of race. I am told off explicitly and given sundry journalistic minutiae, ranging from fringe groups proclaiming the unassailability of white power to lunatic psychotics who intermittently wage a spate of battles against blacks and other people of color. Now, these are tragic occurrences that should arouse the anguish and indignation of all Americans, white, black, yellow, and all the shades in between. But I sense a higher truth about my beloved adopted country, something that does not reside in any politician or in any administration that might be in power at the moment, past, present, something that transcends the pettiness of everyday life and the prejudices of cadres of individuals of many different groups. I sense a spirit, a geist to the nation I love, and the people whom I decided after having traveled all over the world are my favorite people in the world. Who are these people? The American people. What is the fundamental nature of this country and its profound moral meaning? How has my life as a black immigrant been shaped or not by the racial politics of the nation I have called my home for the past 32 years? What is the truth about the nature of race and racial politics in this country I love that these detractors would shame me for loving? And why have some, such as myself, an immigrant from Jamaica, along with countless other immigrants and a significant number of blacks who have been born and raised in America, been able to achieve some modicum of success and others only superlative achievements? Why were others thought to be inevitably barred from the dream simply by virtue of their race and by insuperable barriers created by a racial superstructure and its vanguards? If such were the case, did these white vanguards owe anything at all to the black individuals whose sufferings and hopelessness the detractors brandished as evidence of the utter irrefutability of an oppressive America? Did the individuals who failed within the system and who were held up as certified moral icons of innocence and victimization constitute a group that contained certain pathological features that ran either concurrently or independently to the system that had structurally stymied their existence and prevented them from flourishing? Was it the white vanguards who were responsible for the 2/3 of blacks born to unwed mothers and whose births have largely condemned them to a life of poverty? Was it the white vanguards who have been responsible for the disproportionate number of murders committed by black men that resulted in mass incarcerations that have blithely been referred to as the new form of Jim Crow in America? Mass incarcerations of people who commit crimes should not be referred to as racism. Its proper appellation is justice. Why have I never in my life in this country been disappointed by it? And why, in spite of racial resistance from time to time, often and mostly from the detractors themselves, who identified as progressives and radicals for a better world, have I never sought to actively fight racism, but have simply adduced myself as evidence of its absolute irrationality? But the biggest question and challenge about race in America came to me as a shock and deep psychological relief, and one that left me with hope. As a black man living in America and studying her past very carefully, I came to see that race, while always endemic to America, was never metaphysically relevant to the true moral meaning of this country. In fact, the very concept of race itself is a deep betrayal of the identity of the fundamental moral nature of the United States of America. I know this is a controversial position to hold, but in the ensuing pages and in this book, I explain very, very carefully what I believe is a true, magnificent moral meaning of this country, and I explain why racial injustice has always been a betrayal of the true spirit of America. It is for this reason, I believe with all my heart, that we have and will continue to make racial progress in this country, and that one day this noble and magnificent country will be a truly great cosmopolitan and colorblind society. My convictions about America can be found by retracing my perceptions and an analysis of the nation through my intimate experiences with its people. My convictions would be forged by witnessing the lives of, as well as the character traits of other immigrants, mostly from humble origins, and those of black Americans who had embraced the dream and faced the head-on challenges required for succeeding in America. My ideas about the moral meaning of America were derived from studying the history of the country itself. Later in my journey in discovering the moral meaning of America, I came to understand, as an academic philosopher, that it was in our institutions of higher learning, or universities, that the real destruction of America was taking place. Our nation's universities, in their advocacy of Americophobia, are not only sites of national security threats, they are the purveyors and repositories of racial divisiveness in this country. The biggest breach in this country is not between blacks and whites, it is between the intellectuals and the people. There is a formula for success in this great nation. I, as well as others, have discovered it and applied it to our lives. In this process, as people of color, we have discovered the irrefutable metaphysical irrelevance of race in the United States of America as it applies to our lives. In essence, we have overcome it and its binding hold against a march towards inevitable achievement. I remain convinced that until that sense of the psychological irrelevance of race is internalized personally, and thus becomes a part of one's schema for being in the world, that one will be compromised not by so-called structural and systemic racism, but rather by the psychic and deterministic hindrances that inflate the importance of race at the cost of an intransigent individualism, personal responsibility, self-accountability, and the reach for never-ending aspirational identity that is wedded to grit, rationality, determination, resilience, faith, tenacity, self-cultivation, frugality, and a healthy dose of emotional stoicism. So, those are the opening pages of the book. And then I go on to describe the enormous struggle that I had in my early years in America, where I most emphatically did not rely on government help to put myself through school. I worked up, I think in typical Jamaican style, most Jamaicans, have about 6 jobs when they come to this country. I came to America with $100 in my pocket and worked up to 4 jobs to put myself through school. It was an enormous struggle, and I thought it would never happen. But I did graduate magna cum laude, and I was telling Joe, I got into 25 law schools without studying for the LSAT. I didn't refuse to study for that exam. It was my mother's dream that I become a lawyer. And I went in cold turkey, and I got into 25 law schools, and I trashed all of the acceptance letters because I knew I wanted to do a PhD in philosophy after all. But was fortunate to get a scholarship to do my PhD and got a respite from having had to work 45 hours a week and go to school full time and surviving on 4 hours of sleep a night. And eventually did my PhD and became a professor in the academy. And so that's a part of my story. That's not all of it. And then I go on in the book to then describe what I think is the moral meaning of America. That is, I examine America's past. Much of it was not pretty. Much of it does not remain pretty. But it's a complicated story. And I examined the civil rights movement, which I describe as the third founding of America. I won't give away too much of what's in the book, because then you'll be disincentivized from buying the book. But I talk a lot about immigrants in the story and how they make it personal lives of people whom I have met, who with faith and tenacity and grit and above all frugality. You know, if you give an immigrant $10,000, he's going to find a way of investing it. If you give other types of people $10,000, they spend it. They spend it. It's much harder to keep money it's very hard to keep money. It's just hard to keep money. It's easy to spend it. Immigrants are really good at keeping money, sometimes under their mattress, which is not a wise thing to do. But I tell the story of immigrants who made it. One immigrant who was Vietnamese, who couldn't speak a word of English, and was stuffing envelopes in a bank alongside myself, and convinced the bank to give him a loan. I don't know, in his broken English, he somehow convinced the bank to give him a loan to open a small Vietnamese restaurant, and dropped out of college because his only purpose in going to college was to learn English. And 20 years later went back and completed a college degree because he could, because that's the American way. You do it because you can do it. And went bankrupt, and in typical American style, did not complain, did not think anyone owed him anything, did not have a sense of entitlement, which is something I am worried about with the current crop of immigrants who come to this country with a sense of entitlement. My philosophy was, America owes me nothing, and Americans owe me nothing except to keep out of my way and do not place any obstructions in my path, or do not obstruct my efforts to enhance my life. And opened 3 more restaurants and was able to retire at the age of 47, while I'm still toiling away at Depaul, teaching 5 classes a week and grading papers during my spring break. The book ends on a very, very optimistic note, because I still think this is a great country. I think it will continue to be a great country. I think it's as great as today as it ever was. And so I'll probably end there. There's much more that I want to say, but I'm not one of those individuals who think America is in decline. I see no reason to think this great country is in decline, because I do not think that her people are in decline. When I look out at Americans, I see the optimism, I see the can-do spirit, I see the absence of, I've lived in Europe, I've traveled all over the world, and I see the unbreakable spirit of Americans. I see the absence of bitterness, the absence of cynicism, and the absence of doom that are so unique to Americans. And once those traits and those characteristics and those attributes remain formidably and indelibly imprinted in the American psyche, I think there'll always be hope for America.
questions now for anybody? Susanna's going to start. Okay, go ahead, please.
I guess one of the big sources of confusion today, I think, is the use of either the word liberal or progressive for the individuals on the left side of the political scale, because I think that they are actually leftists, hard leftists, which in the line of communists, hard socialists, maybe to some extent, if you go far enough left, anarchists. And that philosophy is the exact opposite of what a true liberal would believe, at least a classical liberal. So, but what worries me is these are the people who are very dominant in the universities, and the universities are, and as well as elementary schools, high schools, it's moved down. They are shaping our young people's attitudes and values, and that's what makes me worry more than anything about the future, because are our young people being taught to all of the things that entails? Totalitarian mindsets, the government taking over everybody's lives, everybody feeling entitled, raising victimhood to a very high status, everything that's opposite to what the American dream or the American spirit or the American character is supposed to be about.
Pardon,
I wonder, will our character change?
So the audio on the questions isn't coming through so well, so if we could keep the questions short, and if you would mind just briefly summarizing before you answer. Sorry for jumping in.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that the progressive left is cultivating a mindset, a totalitarian collectivist mindset that is inimical to the spirit of classical liberalism, which was about individualism, the individualism of yesterday, basically. Yes. I think this is right. And actually, my publisher said to me, what do you want your next book to be about? And I said, I can tell you what the title is. The title is going to be called Disband and Defund, Protecting America from the Dangers of America's Universities. I think this is true. I think that I consider myself a classical liberal in the 19th century sense, right? So I'm very fiscally conservative. I think there's something grossly unethical about the state of the welfare state, where we create victims, where we expropriate people's agencies from them, and we disable their ability to take care of themselves, and we basically, in some sense, tell them that they can't do for themselves what they're able to do. But not only that, I think what we find happening, aside from a steady dose of anti-Americanism that is going on in the American universities, what we have among the far left professoriate who hates America and makes no bones about it, and is preaching anti-capitalism, anti-individualism, collectivism, is, I will make no bones about it, I've been in the academy for 22 years, and I've been a professor for 22 years. I've been in the academy for long, but I've been a professor for 22 years. And without being a conspiracy theorist, I think that what the far left professoriate are doing is creating a band of individuals who will vote this country into socialism. And that's why I think the absence of, let's say, conservative voices, reasonable conservative voices in the humanities and the social sciences is missing. It's grossly missing. And so when you create this plantation class of dependents in, let's say, certain fields of studies, right? Whether you're talking about ethnic studies, for example, which is one field of studies where you create you manufacture certain ideologies of dependencies that, in the form of identity politics, you create a mindset among people where the state is meant to be seen as the only viable solution to their problems. And people are weaned from finding solutions for themselves in terms of their own creative, finding their own identities. The state manufactures identities for themselves. I think this is a very dangerous thing. I think we have a university. There's so much I could say, and I'm sounding inarticulate. I usually am not inarticulate because I'm struggling to say so much in a few minutes. I think part of the problem is to simply have more private institutions, for example, on the higher level of education, and to take away control of education from the state at the higher level, and to privatize education more.
I'm glad you hit on the hatred of capitalism in general in schools. I work at a place called Triton College, and just about a year ago, there was a special seminar, like not a seminar, like a one-day event that one of the faculty was putting on. And the title was, "What to Do Now That Capitalism is Dead." And just the title was absurd. The concept is absurd. Even the title itself is just bizarre. Do you have any specific suggestions for students or people that are working in academia, talking to their colleagues? I know it's kind of a general question, but I call and I know the guys, and you're crazy. How could you call capitalism isn't dead? But that's what they're feeding, not just a hatred of, let's say, of conservatism or America, but specifically the economic theory of capitalism. Do you have any specific thoughts or ideas or ways to tackle it?
Well, I think that these universities need to be defunded, and I think alumni need to stop funding these universities. I think when this kind of rubbish, when donors, whether they're $10 a year donors or $10 a month donors or $1 million a year donors, are educated about what they're funding, the sorts of nonsense. These college professors who are teaching this kind of malarkey are still cashing their checks. So in some sense, the corporate donors who are feeding them, these capitalist pigs, whom they call capitalist pigs, capitalism is still obviously well and alive if they're cashing their checks, and their paychecks are funded by corporate donors. They need to be these welfare scholars, because that's what they are. They're welfare scholars, need to be starved. The government needs to stop funding them in some sense, and private donors need in some sense to stop funding universities. They need to be held accountable, right? That's the only solution. It's the sanction of the victims. If you continue spouting this kind of nonsensical malarkey and you get away with it, then there'll be no incentive for you. You have to be punished. You have to be punished. I don't believe in some sort of educational czar. There's a book coming out in July. I can't remember exactly the name of it. It's being published, I think, by Encounter Books, about what higher education needs. And I think the author is going to be advocating something like more governmental oversight. I don't think we need more government oversight. I think we need government withdrawing its funds from higher education, disbanding and defunding. And I think alumni, donors need to be withdrawing their funds and holding these people spewing these hateful these hateful invectives and these falsities from these institutions, and having greater, more truths, having greater intellectual diversity in the universities coming forward.
Yes, I would also like to add that not only are the universities to blame for this decline in patriotism and even education, but the Chicago Teachers Union, like a lot of other unions, look, they've taken away history from a lot of schools, and their civics, and they're even taking away cursive writing. Now, I was always taught, if you can't write, you're not educated.
Right.
What do you suggest that we do? But does it come down to voting? Voting for our civic leaders? To try and help us stop this, this rape of our wonderful country.
Break up the unions.
Yes.
I mean, I know a lot of.
You're right.
I mean, I know a lot of PhD. I know, bust the unions. I know a lot of PhDs who can't get jobs, who would love to be teaching in the high school system, and they can't teach in the high. It's a disgrace. These people with PhDs who would love to be teaching high school, and they can't teach in the high school system. Why can't they teach in the high school system, right? So, first of all, you've got to do something about these unions that are holding our educational system hostage,
Yes.
right? That's the biggest obstacle right there.
Well, like you said, private schools, we just gonna need to have more private schools.
Yes,
The unions are stopping the private schools.
sure. Thank you.
Mark, I think Mark had it. I'm sorry. Linda.
Hi, I'm Mark Barnwell. I attend a lot of college events, so you're still at Depaul, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I saw Milo speak there, or not allowed to speak. I saw Ben Shapiro speak there. The latest thing is they want Stephen Crowder to speak, the louder with how do you say it? Crowder. Yeah, so they want him to speak, and they're not allowing him to speak. Are you involved in any politics at Depaul? Can you say, or will this get you fired if you speak out against and speak for free speech at Depaul? And do you know what's the latest with Stephen being allowed?
I do not know. I don't. I was. I can't be fired because I have tenure, and I've had tenure for 13 years. But even if I didn't have tenure, I would be an outspoken. I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I was one of the very few faculty members who was a vocal supporter of having Milo Yiannopoulos speak on campus, much to the chagrin of my colleagues. Although I don't agree with a lot of what Milo has to say, that's besides the point. The young Republicans, the Republicans at Depaul were granted autonomy on campus. So I reasoned like a lawyer, right? I said, look, if you're going to grant a student organization autonomy, and if you grant them vetting power, and Milo was vetted, and he was vetted by a group of committee members, which included faculty members, and he was given the green light. You cannot at the last minute, because you don't endorse politically what he says, just bar him from coming on campus. So I think it's disgraceful. I think it's disgraceful what's going on across American campuses. I think these radical left-wingers who are trying to hold us hostage intellectually, ideologically, and prevent free speech from occurring on campus is very, very dangerous intellectually. I think it has to be stopped. I think, again, the only way that it can be stopped is for alumni and the state to defund those universities, to punish those universities that persist in this kind of intellectual dishonesty. That's the only real solution. When you have someone, an honorable and respectful woman like Condoleezza Rice, being regarded as a hate speaker, there is no lower place to go in terms of intellectual obscenity. Whether one agrees with her, I happen to agree with her on a lot of issues. I actually acknowledge her in my book, in the acknowledgement page, as someone who has influenced my thinking profoundly on political affairs and international politics. But simply because you see, the far left, they're like children because they're cultural relativists. They have abandoned all reasoning. They stamp their feet like 2-year-olds. If you disagree with them, it means that you're hateful. When you, in some sense, have abandoned reason and argument, rational argumentation as criteria for adjudicating among truth claims, then you have become nothing but a lobotomized, you become nothing but an automaton. And I think this is what is being inculcated in students today, that violence and a show of fists are sufficient to reconcile disputes, and not the old-fashioned philosophical give and take, rejoinders. You give your viewpoint, I disagree with you, I issue a rejoinder, you issue a counterfactual, I issue a counter-argument, and I do not assume that I'm infallible. I assume my fallibility. I assume that you are equally fallible, and that reasonable people can also reasonably disagree, and that we dispute and argue. But this is lost, I think, on the far left. And I think that it's amazing that in the 60s, the far left was the group that was fighting for free speech. And today it's the far left that has given up on free speech.
Linda, did you have a question?
Yes. First of all, I just want to say it's so wonderful to hear another viewpoint on immigration besides the one we're hearing in the media all the time. And I'm just wondering, would you say there is a different way of approaching legal versus illegal immigration? Nobody seems to ever treat them separately. And what would be your view on illegal immigration as opposed to?
Well, I came here legally. My grandmother was, we did it the old-fashioned way, where my grandmother's brother was married to an American, and he sponsored my grandmother, who acquired a green card, who then sponsored my mother, who then sponsored her children, and this was under the Reagan administration, Mr. Reagan was a very fair-minded man when it came to immigration, I must say. Back then, you had to issue a financial affidavit to show that if you were sponsoring someone, you had the financial means to support them. So before we could come to this country, my mother had to show that she had all the means of acquiring a job to support her 2 children so that we would not be financial leeches on the state. My grandmother had to come to the States and work in her 60s, actually, and acquire sufficient funds to show that she could support my mother, right? So that my mother would not be a financial dependent on the state. And so I think that every nation and every state has the right to secure the necessary conditions and criteria to determine who gets let into its borders. You cannot have a situation of absolute open borders because you cannot tax the infrastructures of a nation to the point where the citizens who are paying taxes themselves have their lifestyles compromised. That's just basically an unfair and untenable situation to put people in. And you cannot have a situation where the infrastructures are so taxed that the immigrants themselves can't take care of themselves, that the opportunities that they're pursuing are bled to death. So I would like to see us go back to I'll tell you what bothers me about the current debate on immigration. Immigration is not a right, it is a privilege. And we speak today we speak about immigration as if it's a human right. But you're not born with a right to migrate to Germany or to the United States of America. If you're lucky, you get that privilege bestowed upon you by a country. It's a privilege, not a right. But we live in an age of aggrievement, and I call this now the age of entitlement, where misfortune is seen as the primary justification for entitlement. Misfortune today is seen as the primary justification for reward. Not your own efforts, not your own initiative, but simply being misfortune is a fundamental criterion for reward. And I think that's a very, very bad thing. I think misfortune is horrible, and anyone who through an accident of birth is born into misfortune, it's a tragic affairs. It's a tragic state of affairs. But you cannot turn misfortune into the fundamental means of bestowing reward on someone. And so this is what bothers me about when I turn on the television and I hear certain progressives saying things on the order of, and I hear certain people on the far left saying certain things like, the only solution is to give undocumented immigrants the right to vote. Like, this is part of the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement. They want to not only just break up banks and provide free education to all blacks, but they want to give undocumented or illegal immigrants the right to vote. And I think it makes the situation really, really difficult for legal immigrants, aspiring legal immigrants, old-fashioned immigrants. It robs them of their credibility, and it makes the whole immigration debate a really murky, murky one, because all immigrants now become tainted by the way that the dialogue is taking, the manner in which the dialogue is taking place.
It's 6 o'clock, and I think some students have to leave, so please, by all means, take food on the way out the door. I don't think anyone will mind if we have one more question or so, if there's anything left. Students have class at 6, so if they get, it's okay, guys. Grab some food, by all means.
Professor, would you say that George Soros is behind a lot of groups like Black Lives Matter? What would these people even come up with the idea of suggesting that illegals come in here? You know, I mean, their whole movement, for me, is two-staged. And George Soros is behind, he hates this country. He's behind a whole lot of this with his money.
Right. I mean, I do think there's the movement is so intellectually out of focus that it's really, really hard to say, to give them the sort of credit that one should give them. I mean, I do think, I don't know if he's personally behind them. I mean, I think there's a lot of financial maneuverings behind the movement. And they're so intellectually out of focus, it's really hard to take them seriously. I do think they started off with pretty good intentions. That is, they had a very narrow, specific focus at one point, that is to address the issue of police shootings of unarmed black men. But they became so intellectually out of focus. They started attacking Israel and calling Israel a genocidal apartheid state, right? Which was so unfair to attack the only legitimate democratic state in that region of the world.
But they never said anything about black people killing other black people. That's why I never took them seriously.
Well, it's hard to really take them seriously on those grounds, right? When you attack Israel as a genocidal apartheid state, right? A state that is under siege, right? Is basically under siege and has a right to protect itself, has a right to exist.
For 2,000 years it's been under siege.
Right. And is assailed on all fronts by all sorts of illiberal governments in that region and cultures in that region. It's really, really hard to take the movement quite seriously. I mean, they've lost their credibility as far as I'm concerned. I'm not impressed anymore.
Now, that's why I say I think that these are these fringe groups that have all been pushed to surround and to help bring down America. See, I think that we're already in a civil war. I really feel that.
I hope not.
Any final questions for Professor Hill? All right, thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate it.